Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, when Tom Holland's Spider-Man opens the multiverse, he soon discovers that there's no way home.
Directly following Far From Home, Peter Parker, played by Tom Holland, is struggling with the fallout from being framed for Mysterio's death and having his identity as Spider-Man exposed, with it affecting everyone he cares about, including girlfriend MJ, played by Zendaya, Marisa Tomei's Aunt May, Jacob Batalon's Ned, and Jon Favreau's Happy Hogan. In desperation, Peter turns to Doctor Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, to try and cast a spell to make everyone forget that he's Spider-Man, but Peter's meddling tears a hole in the multiverse. Now Spider-Man's greatest enemies from other universes have come through into Peter's world, including Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus, Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin, Jamie Foxx's Electro, Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman, and Rhys Ifans' Lizard, and he must find a way of sending them back to their respective universes and restore the multiverse.
Spider-Man No Way Home is the third and final film in the Home trilogy, and once again it's directed by Jon Watts, who has helmed the previous two standalone Spider-Man movies. Now when I reviewed Homecoming way back when, I was very broadly positive about it. I found it to be surprisingly fresh, given it was the third incarnation of the character in a 15-year span, and that's in large part because Tom Holland has been so perfectly cast in the role. He is always fantastic in it, even if the writing for him has been decidedly inconsistent, to say the least. But certainly when I saw that movie, I saw a lot of potential for the character going forward in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I don't think has entirely been met. It was certainly compounded by the time of its sequel, Far From Home, which I really didn't like. In fact, it might actually be my least favourite MCU movie to date, because the plot doesn't make any sense, there's less stakes about it in hindsight, and Peter is continually written as an idiot just for the plot to function. But perhaps the biggest issue, even more than those, is that it didn't feel very much like a Spider-Man movie. The MCU Spider-Man has been so closely tied to Tony Stark, even after his death, that it actually feels like he's more being groomed as Iron Man Jr. than the Spider-Man we traditionally know and love. It feels like the MCU Spidey is all about gadgets and suits, which is not really what the character's ever truly been about. So, given that I wasn't a big fan of that movie, I approached No Way Home with a certain amount of trepidation, especially with the knowledge of the fact that they were folding previous continuities into the movie, following in the footsteps of Into the Spider-Verse, and I thought this could definitely be a recipe for a movie that could be a total mess. And I'm pleased to report that not only is it not that, but I also like this a fair bit more than its predecessor. If there is one way to describe No Way Home, it is most certainly a lot. There is so much going on in this movie that it's actually hard to keep track of it all, let alone talk about it, but I'm going to give it my absolute best shot. This is a movie that's trying to do so much simultaneously that perhaps the best way of actually talking about it is breaking down those ambitions one by one, starting with the fact that this is meant to be the capper to a trilogy of films with Tom Holland, and in that respect, it is something of a mixed bag. The movie picks up just seconds after the mid-credits scene of Far From Home, where Mysterio has not only framed Peter for his death, but also exposed his secret identity. So this is a Spider-Man that has not only lost his anonymity, but is also thought of as a murderer by the wider public. This is literally a plot that could have been an entire movie all by itself, and unfortunately we know that the movie is not really going down this route. It's there in the first act to largely set up the actual plot of the movie from about the half-hour mark, and in that respect it does feel like something of a waste, because you could have done a lot with this idea, but the movie's not really interested in any of it, and once the real plot of the movie starts happening, it definitely falls by the wayside. Another thing that gets very quickly dropped from the movie is the high school cast of Homecoming and Far From Home. They are present here once again, but only very briefly in borderline cameo appearances in most cases. They're reintroduced in that first act, and then they vanish once the multiverse stuff starts happening, which is understandable from a writing perspective, because obviously this movie has an enormous cast. We've got to drop characters somewhere, but even so, it's not very much of a farewell for those characters, especially considering that we spent 2 movies with them. But the film definitely hones in on its core group of characters, Peter, MJ, Ned, Happy, and Aunt May, and in some respects, it allows them to shine a bit more than they have done previously, especially Marisa Tomei's Aunt May, who up until this point has been largely squandered in these Spider-Man films. Tomei is a fantastic performer. She's an Oscar winner, but she's had hardly anything to do up until this point. She was barely even in Far From Home. Here, she gets a much more expanded, important role in the film, and actually manages to finally make her mark on Aunt May as a character, and I think that she does really well in the movie. We finally get something a little bit more out of that character than just characters talking about how hot Aunt May is. At last, Aunt May actually feels like Aunt May in these movies. Speaking of characters that are written far more how they should be, it definitely seems like the filmmakers were listening to the complaints that people had about the MCU Spider-Man, those same complaints that I had earlier, that he's far too closely wed to Iron Man to the point where it feels like the character has lost a lot of what made him unique. And it does feel like this movie makes a concerted effort to try and fix that, and try and reconfigure Holland's Spider-Man into something a lot more traditional. Now, that's not to say that problem issues from the previous films aren't still present here. Holland's Spider-Man is still using Stark technology because obviously this is the same continuity. He's still got the nanosuit and various bits and bobs, but it feels less egregious here. It takes something of a backseat, thankfully, and I do think that it's forgivable because at the heart of the movie, it definitely understands that Spider-Man is a kid from Queens that's trying to do his very best for everyone, even at tremendous personal cost. That is who Spider-Man is, and I think by the end of the movie, it's very clear that the filmmakers truly understand that, and I think that Holland is perhaps the best he's ever been in the role, certainly the most confident. It has a true beating heart, even as there's various story pieces being thrown around because there is actually an emotional through line. And on that note, it's really lovely to see the off-screen chemistry between Holland and Zendaya be reflected back on screen as well. The scenes that they share together have a really romantic vibe to them. There's a natural playfulness about it, and I do think that Zendaya is one of the best parts of this entire trilogy. I probably said all the way back in Homecoming that she was going to be a star. She's definitely one by this point, and I like the way that she plays MJ in a very different way to previous Spider-Man love interests that we've seen in various other films over the years, in that she feels a little bit caustic and unpredictable and sarcastic. She's a really fun performer, and she has a considerable presence about her. It's a shame the movie has to sideline her for stretches of the narrative. She spends good chunks of this movie just watching Peter on laptop screens and various other things, and that's a little bit disappointing. I would have liked to have seen her be pushed a little bit more to the forefront, and it does feel like the movie doesn't quite know what to do with their relationship at certain points, but when it comes to the fore, I think those are some of the best moments in the movie. Which brings us to the next objective, which is Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange's appearance in this movie is largely to set up plot points in his own sequel next year, Multiverse of Madness, directed by original Spider-Man helmet Sam Raimi. But Strange's appearance also serves another role, that of a mentor figure for Peter, which has been in all of these home movies to date. Obviously in Homecoming, that was Tony Stark, who kept a watchful eye over Peter, and in Far From Home, that was kind of shared between Nick Fury and Mysterio before he revealed his true colours. Now, in this movie, Strange is kind of watching over Peter, and it is kind of fitting actually, because let's face it, Doctor Strange's own movie kind of follow the plot beats of the original Iron Man in many respects, so of course he feels like a Stark surrogate. There is something of a similar dynamic at play here, in that Peter has this youthful, sunny optimism, whereas Cumberbatch's Strange has this kind of cynical, older view of things, that he's very much more downbeat about the situation. And I do think that the instigating moment of this movie is a bit of a problem for me. I mentioned before how I've not really liked the fact that Peter has been written quite stupidly over the course of these films. Like, I know that the character is meant to make mistakes, and certainly that was a thing that I kind of praised Homecoming about. It showed a young, inexperienced Spider-Man, but I feel like Far From Home took way too many liberties with that, especially in the sequence where he nearly blew up his classmates, and the instigating spell of this movie is a big example of that. It feels very much out of character for Doctor Strange to just enable that, but especially from Peter's perspective, because they literally make a joke out of it, how that's his first course of action after being rejected from MIT along with his friends, instead of just calling up the admissions office at MIT to try and sort out the situation. And it's an example of a bad joke, because it only calls attention to and intensifies an issue that's inherent to the premise of the movie, which requires Peter to be incredibly selfish and short-sighted and play around with the fabric of time and space to suit his own personal ends. It feels like this series of movies has a bit of a problem with writing Peter so that he takes the worst possible decision he could make at any given moment just purely so the story can move forward, and then trying to make a gag out of it as if to say, yeah, we're aware of how stupid this course of action is. It just kind of rankled with me. It's a bit of a bugbear inherent to just the story of the movie itself. That being said, though, I do like that Strange and Peter have very different approaches to trying to solve the problem once it occurs, which finally comes to a head in a showdown between the two characters, which is definitely one of the movie's major highlights. That particular sequence makes extensive use of the mirror universe, which we haven't really seen very much of since it was introduced in the Doctor Strange movie way back when, and it feels like having Spider-Man play around in that environment, and you've got these very Inception-like visuals of the buildings folding. It's very comic booky and has a lot of visual invention that I think makes it really stand out, especially between a lot of Marvel set pieces that kind of feel a bit overly storyboarded, whereas this actually has a very kind of clever flow to it. I really like the visuals of this sequence. Which brings us to the most important aim of all, which is namely to fold the previous continuities of Spider-Man into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and on that count, the movie is a resounding success. That's in large part because the cast they've brought back for this movie reprise their roles without missing a beat whatsoever. When Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe show back up as Dr. Octopus and the Green Goblin respectively, they are just as brilliant as when they first portrayed those characters 20 years ago. They literally look like they've just stepped out of their respective movies. That's how flawless it is. And let's be honest, Molina and Dafoe were absolutely phenomenal in those respective roles. It is a real pleasure to see them get to reprise them through the miracle of franchising, roles that we never thought we'd see them again because those characters got killed off in those respective movies. So having them back again is already a kind of miracle in of itself, and it looks like they are really enjoying this really rare opportunity, and certainly they are one major highlight of this movie. They're certainly the two villains that get the most prominence and screen time, and there's a reason for that, because honestly, they are the best out of the set. Jamie Foxx also gets quite a bit of prominence here as Electro, and it feels like he's relishing a chance to essentially get a do-over on Electro, because it feels like the film makes a very concerted effort to try and just retcon everything about the Amazing Spider-Man 2 version of the character. It is ostensibly that, but they definitely go out of their way to just make him look like Jamie Foxx and everything. The movie definitely makes a concerted effort to try and reconfigure some of the villains like Electro and Goblin into something closer to towards their traditional comic book counterparts, at least in terms of their appearances, and address some of the criticisms that fans have had about their adaptations in movies past. However, not all the villains really get as much room to shine. Thomas Hayden Church reprises his role as Sandman from Spider-Man 3 and Rhys Ifans' Lizard from The Amazing Spider-Man, but those are largely 95% of the time through their CGI counterparts, which they voice. They do very briefly appear in the movie in human form, but that's only for a couple of shots near the end. Otherwise, it's largely through CGI work, and this kind of calls attention to the fact that the movie does have some degree of compartmentalization, both in terms of its actual story structure, where it shuttles characters off screen for stretches and then brings them back, but also in just the way that it was filmed. And maybe some of this is because obviously this filmed during COVID, but also because it's not uncommon for Marvel films to try and work around their actors' schedules by filming them all separately. And there are a couple of moments in this that do feel conspicuously like shots have been kind of patched together in that respect. Again, given the circumstances, kind of understandable, especially given the cast is so huge and we're filming this during a pandemic. That being said though, I did really enjoy the fact that these villains are kind of all brought together in the same space, and there are some great moments to that, especially when they get to interact with one another and they kind of talk about their various circumstances. There are lines of dialogue that feel like the characters are just kind of explaining their backstories for audience members that don't really remember their respective movies, but there are a couple of little twinkling gems, like the fact that Sandman and Electro share a moment reflecting upon their very similar origin stories, little playful moments like that. I do feel like the middle act of this movie takes a lot of inspiration from Into the Spider-Verse in that respect, and having all these various incarnations from different versions of the character all in the same space. However, I do think in terms of actual success, it's a bit different from Into the Spider-Verse, because Into the Spider-Verse was a movie unto itself. You didn't need to see any of the previous Spider-Man films because it introduced new continuities within itself. Various incarnations were all meant to just stand alone by themselves. So if you came to that movie not having seen a Spider-Man film at all, it would work. The same is definitely not true of No Way Home. In order to have a working understanding of everything that's going on in this movie, you have to have seen Doctor Strange and all the MCU Spider-Man films, including Infinity War and Endgame, and also have seen the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films and the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man films. So you have to have a working knowledge of at least 8 to 9 different movies just going into this one. And that's not meant to be a dig. I'm just saying it doesn't work as a standalone movie. If you're someone that has seen the Sam Raimi characters in this and think you can just pick up from there, this is more the Avengers Endgame of Spider-Man movies. It's the culmination of 2 decades of cinematic material in various guises, all moulded together at once. It's like coming into a television series in the 5th season halfway through. It really won't make sense to anyone who hasn't really been following on the Marvel train. It's essentially made for people like me who have seen all of these movies pretty much and know exactly what's going on about it. And that's fine, because it doesn't really work as a story onto itself. It works as a fan service machine. It kind of works on the assumption that you know all this stuff already and plays on the buttons of the familiarity. It's the same thing as, oh, I remember that in Ghostbusters Afterlife, which I recently criticised. It kind of comes from a similar place, but it feels a bit more sincere and genuine here, and it works a lot better here. Does it arguably work better for me personally because this is my own nostalgia? I'll leave that up for you to decide, but even so, I do think that it is successful in really kind of pulling all these things together in a way that definitely evokes the sense of a comic book crossover event. And there's definitely valid criticisms to be made about the fact that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is so dense that it replicates the continuity problems of comic books in general, and that it's hard to get new people invested because of so much being interlinked. I don't think that it's going to be so much of a problem here, because most of the target audience will have seen all of those movies, or at least vaguely remember them enough for this to go down as well as it does, and certainly it is a crowd pleaser in its best moments. Is it as good as Into the Spider-Verse? I don't think it is. It doesn't have quite the same level as Invention, certainly on a visual level. In fact, it does seem a little bit utilitarian in typical Marvel style. However, in terms of doing that kind of story in a live-action space, it actually succeeds far more than you would expect it to, and enough that I think that audiences might almost not even notice the fact that Tom Holland and his respective storyline kind of gets crushed under the weight of all this other stuff being brought in on top of it, which is a little bit unfortunate. Okay, at this point I have to talk about something that's very significant, and that means I'm going into spoilers, so if that's the thing you care about, swing your web out here please. Time code is down there. So, as you probably already know, thanks to the worst kept secret on Twitter's trending topics, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield also reprised their roles as their respective incarnations of Spider-Man. And to full credit of Jon Watts, he is fully aware of just how fantastic it is to have all three live-action versions of Spider-Man sharing the same space. Once they arrive in time for the third act, they're not just extended cameos, they actually get full-fledged supporting parts in the movie, and they actually have a bit more screen time than you would expect them to have. That's in large part because Watts realises that this is a magical moment that he has managed to conjure up, and decides to take full advantage of it, and actually stops the movie to have them just kind of hang out. So this very busy movie actually manages to quiet down for Garfield and Maguire to actually spend time with Tom Holland's version of the character, and they just have small talk for a few moments before the finale rolls round. And yeah, it is a little bit of an indulgence, but it's also one that I was fully on board with, because honestly, it's nice to see all this kind of character-based stuff in their interactions, and certainly it's stuff that fans have imagined over the years or in fanfic, and it's kind of surreal to have it actually come to life on screen like this. And I do think that there's a lot of humour in the way they interact, and they're kind of freaked out about the fact that Tobey Maguire's version can actually shoot webs out of his wrist without requiring some other kind of invention in that case. And it's just nice to just see them hang out and really enjoy being back in their roles in the same way the villains are. And I think that in Garfield's case, he actually benefits from this enormously. Tobey Maguire had an entire trilogy of films that had a very definite ending in that regard, whereas Garfield, his run was obviously cut short after the second movie, which had a very divided reception, to say the least. And I think in this case, it actually brings a little bit of closure to his incarnation of the character. It feels like there's very deliberate choices here to try and actually tie up some of those loose ends. And I feel like that's really a nice thing for them to do for Garfield. And the film's final movement, where Peter decides to wipe the memories of everyone who ever knew about him, including MJ, definitely casts a distinct line in the sand about criticisms about the character being too closely linked to the MCU by severing him from it entirely. And I do think this is a rather extreme answer to that problem, and I'm feeling a little bit conflicted about it, because on the one hand, yes, now that we've manoeuvred the character into this position where he's the Spider-Man we know and love more accurately, there's a whole realm of open possibilities in that. However, it does mean that we lose quite a few things along the way, especially in regard to Zendaya's MJ, where I'm not sure if they're going to bring her back, because obviously there is a fourth film announced, but it's largely going to be a clean slate, it looks like, and that's disappointing, because honestly, she's one of the better characters in this incarnation of the universe, and if this really is her farewell, that's a bit of a shame, to be honest. However, I do feel like the whole idea that Spider-Man embraces the idea that second chances are always possible, that there is redemption and solution even in the darkest moments. I feel like that approach, especially with regard to his attitude towards the villains, that is what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man, and I came out of this movie feeling like Jon Watts had really reassessed his interpretation of the character and brought him exactly where he needed to be in some respects, even if I'm not sure if I totally agree with how they got there. As you can probably tell, I have very complicated, conflicting feelings about No Way Home. I don't think it's entirely successful at all the things it tries to do. In terms of being a capper to Holland's trilogy, I feel like it gets crowded out by all the other things that are brought into this movie. There are script decisions I don't really agree with. Some of the humour I found a little bit forced and irritating. Do we really need to have jokes about the Green Goblin looking like an elf, for goodness sake? But the stuff that it really works at is very successful. Bring all these past performers in, they're great, they're really fantastic in reprising those roles, and I feel like it's a genuine crowd pleaser. If you really have been following the Spider-Man films to this point, you're gonna get a lot of satisfaction out of this movie. It's gonna feel like a dream come true in a lot of ways, even if I do think there are compromises along the way. I will say though, this is definitely a huge step up from its predecessor, and I think that in terms of being a Spider-Man movie, it's very strong in that regard, because I think it has the character's core principles at its heart. And yes, it is messy and unwieldy and all over the place, but I can't deny I definitely got hooked in its web. If you'd like this review, then you can shoot a web to my Ko-fi page, or you can swing over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.